They called it Operation Washout, a training exercise designed to break her. 20 men, hand-picked by the major himself, each one ordered to make her quit. By the time the sun set that evening, 14 of them would be in the medical facility, 5 would refuse to continue, and 1 would become her strongest advocate. This is the story of Irene Hill, the young woman they tried to destroy, who instead rewrote every rule in the book. What happened on that training field didn't just change her career. It transformed an entire military base's understanding of strength, resilience, and what it truly means to be a warrior. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The morning briefing room at Forward Base Sentinel smelled of stale coffee and old resentment. Irene Hill sat in the back corner, her posture rigid, her hazel eyes fixed on the tactical map covering the far wall. At 23, she was the youngest soldier in the room and the only woman in the advanced combat training program. Neither fact had escaped anyone's attention. Major Vincent Kellerman stood at the podium, his thick arms crossed over his chest as he addressed the assembled troops. He was a man built like a tank, with a jaw that looked carved from granite and eyes that held all the warmth of a winter storm. He'd made his opinion about women in combat roles abundantly clear over the past 6 weeks, though he was careful to couch his prejudice in concerns about unit cohesion and physical standards. Today's exercise focuses on close-quarters combat scenarios, Kellerman announced, his voice carrying the authority of 25 years of service. You'll be working in pairs, rotating through different opponents. The objective is to demonstrate proficiency in hand-to-hand combat techniques under pressure. Irene's training partner, Lieutenant Anderson, shifted uncomfortably beside her. He was one of the few men in the unit who treated her with basic professional courtesy, though even he seemed perpetually anxious about being associated with her. The social cost of not participating in the casual mockery that followed her through the barracks was higher than most were willing to pay. Hill. Kellerman's voice cut through the room like a blade. You'll be rotating through all opponents today. Consider it an opportunity to prove you belong here. The room fell silent. Rotating through all opponents meant facing every man in the program, one after another, with minimal rest between matches. It was a requirement that had never been imposed on any other trainee, a standard that existed solely for her. Irene stood, her 5'6" frame seeming suddenly small in a room full of men who averaged 6 inches taller and 50 pounds heavier. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the acid churning in her stomach. She'd known this was coming. For 6 weeks, she'd endured the sideways glances, the whispered comments, the casual sabotage that made every task twice as difficult as it needed to be. Her equipment would go missing before exercises. Her performance reports would be scrutinized with microscopic intensity, while errors from her male counterparts were overlooked. She'd been assigned to the worst shifts, the most tedious duties, the assignments that seemed designed to grind her down through sheer monotony and exhaustion. But she'd persisted. Every morning, she was the first one on the training field and the last one to leave. Every evening, she studied tactical manuals and combat techniques until her eyes burned. She'd grown up in a small village in the Czech countryside, the daughter of a factory worker and a school teacher, and she'd learned early that the world didn't hand opportunities to people like her. You had to take them, and you had to fight to keep them. As the briefing dispersed, Irene caught fragments of conversation that made her hands clench into fists. About time someone showed her the door, Sergeant Novak muttered to his companion. She's been dead weight since day 1. I give her 3 rounds before she's crying for medical. Private Davies added with a cruel laugh. This is going to be entertaining. Irene walked past them without acknowledgement, her face a mask of calm professionalism. She'd learned not to react to the provocations, not to give them the satisfaction of knowing their words landed. But inside, something was building, a pressure that had been accumulating for weeks, compressed by every dismissal, every insult, every casual cruelty disguised as military discipline. The training facility was a converted warehouse on the edge of the base, its concrete floors marked with combat circles and its walls lined with protective padding. The space smelled of sweat and liniment, a familiar scent that usually filled Irene with anticipation. Today, it felt different. Today felt like a reckoning. Major Kellerman stood in the center of the main combat circle, clipboard in hand, his expression suggesting he was about to witness something he'd been waiting for. Around him, the other trainees gathered, forming a loose circle of spectators. This wasn't going to be a private humiliation. This was going to be public theater. Standard rules apply, Kellerman announced. 3-minute rounds, 30-second rest periods. Matches continue until one opponent is incapacitated, surrenders, or I call the match. Hill, you'll face opponents in order of seniority, starting with Private Davies. Davies stepped into the circle with the confidence of someone who'd already won. He was built like a linebacker, all broad shoulders and thick muscle, with a reputation for aggressive combat techniques that skirted the edge of acceptable force. He'd made no secret of his opinion that women had no place in military combat roles, and his expression now suggested he was looking forward to proving his point. Irene stepped into the circle opposite him, her mind automatically cataloging his stance, his weight distribution, the way he held his hands. She'd watched Davies fight before, had studied his patterns. He was strong and aggressive, but predictable. He relied on overwhelming force rather than technique, using his size advantage to bully smaller opponents into submission. Ready positions, Kellerman called. Irene settled into her fighting stance, her weight balanced, her breathing controlled. Around her, the spectators grew quiet, the anticipation thick enough to taste. She could feel their expectations pressing down on her, their certainty that she was about to fail, about to prove everything they'd believed about her limitations. Begin. Davies came at her like a freight train, his first punch thrown with enough force to crack ribs. But Irene had already moved, her smaller size and superior footwork allowing her to slip the attack and counter with a precise strike to his exposed flank. The impact made Davies grunt, more from surprise than pain, and he wheeled around with renewed aggression. The next 2 minutes were a dance of violence and evasion. Davies threw punch after punch, each one carrying the weight of his considerable strength. But Irene was never quite where he expected her to be. She'd spent the past 6 weeks not just enduring their contempt, but studying every man in the program, learning their patterns, identifying their weaknesses. When Davies overcommitted on a haymaker punch, Irene saw her opening. She stepped inside his guard, delivered a devastating combination to his solar plexus and kidney, then swept his legs as he doubled over. Davies hit the mat with an impact that echoed through the warehouse. The wind knocked out of him, his face red with exertion and embarrassment. Match, Kellerman called, his voice tight. Hill wins. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, slowly, the murmurs began. Irene didn't wait for them to coalesce into commentary. She simply returned to her corner and waited for the next opponent. By the time she faced her 5th opponent, the atmosphere in the training facility had shifted from amusement to something darker. What had begun as entertainment, watching the woman get put in her place, had transformed into a demonstration that challenged every assumption they'd held about her capabilities. Corporal Jensen was her next challenger, a man known for his technical proficiency in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He approached the match with more caution than Davies had shown, his expression calculating as he circled her. The earlier matches had taught the spectators that Irene wasn't the easy target they'd expected, but most still believed it was only a matter of time before her luck ran out, before she faced someone whose skill and strength were simply too much to overcome. Jensen's strategy was clear from the opening seconds. He intended to take her to the ground, where his grappling expertise and weight advantage would neutralize her speed. It was a sound tactical approach, one that had won him numerous training matches against male opponents. But Irene had anticipated this strategy, had prepared for it during countless hours of additional training that nobody knew about. When Jensen shot in for a takedown, Irene's counter was immediate and brutal. She sprawled, using her flexibility and core strength to prevent the takedown, then delivered a series of knees to his exposed torso. As Jensen tried to recover, she executed a picture-perfect guillotine choke, her technique so precise that Jensen was forced to tap out within 90 seconds. The medical officer on duty, Captain Williams, stepped forward with growing concern. "Major, perhaps we should." "The exercise continues." Kellerman interrupted, his jaw clenched so tight that muscles jumped in his cheeks. His plan had been to break her, to force her to quit through overwhelming physical challenge. Instead, he was watching her dismantle his hand-picked opponents with methodical precision. What Major Kellerman didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Irene had been training for exactly this scenario for years before she ever joined the military. Growing up in a small Czech village, where being the factory owner's daughter made you a target for resentment, she'd learned to defend herself out of necessity. Her father, himself a former amateur boxer, had taught her that skill could overcome strength, that intelligence could triumph over size. But more than that, she developed a philosophy about combat that none of these men understood. To them, fighting was about dominance, about imposing your will through superior force. To Irene, fighting was about adaptation, about reading your opponent and exploiting the gaps in their strategy. Every punch thrown at her carried information. Every missed attack revealed a pattern. She wasn't just fighting these men. She was learning them, understanding them, and using their own aggression against them. The sixth match was against Sergeant Novak, the same man who declared she was dead weight. He entered the circle with visible anger, his earlier mockery transformed into genuine hostility. The fight that followed was vicious, with Novak abandoning technical precision in favor of raw aggression. But aggression without discipline is simply wasted energy. And within 2 minutes, Irene had countered his wild assault with a combination that left him on the mat with a dislocated shoulder. "Medical," Captain Williams called immediately, moving to assist Novak. "Major, I need to insist. I said the exercise continues." Kellerman snapped. But there was something in his voice now, an edge of desperation that hadn't been there before. His plan was unraveling, and everyone in the facility could see it. By the 8th match, the mood had shifted entirely. The spectators were no longer watching entertainment or anticipated failure. They were witnessing something unprecedented, a systematic dismantling of every assumption they'd held about gender, strength, and capability. Private Hutchins, a wrestler with a record of collegiate victories, lasted barely 90 seconds before Irene's technical proficiency overwhelmed his brute force approach. The 9th opponent, Corporal Reed, approached the circle with visible reluctance. He'd watched 8 men before him fall, had seen the pattern that everyone was beginning to recognize. This wasn't luck. This wasn't a fluke. This was skill, preparation, and determination operating at a level that few of them could match. "I forfeit," Reed announced before the match even began. "Sir, I don't see the point of this exercise." Kellerman's face turned a dangerous shade of red. "You will fight, Corporal, or you will face disciplinary action for refusing orders. Then write me up." "Sir," Reed replied, his voice steady, "because I'm not participating in whatever this is." He gestured at the medical officer who was now treating the 4th injured trainee. "This isn't training anymore. This is something else." 2 more soldiers stepped forward, echoing Reed's sentiment. They weren't going to fight. The solidarity wasn't born from respect for Irene, not yet, but from a growing recognition that continuing the exercise served no legitimate training purpose. Kellerman's jaw worked silently for a moment before he turned to the remaining candidates. "Anyone else want to quit?" Silence. But it was a weighted silence, heavy with doubt and reconsideration. "Then we continue," Kellerman declared. "Lieutenant Fletcher, you're next." Fletcher was different from the others. He'd watched every match with analytical intensity, his expression thoughtful rather than hostile. He was the best pure fighter in the program, a former military police officer with extensive combat experience in actual deployments. When he entered the circle, it was with respect rather than contempt. "I've been watching you," Fletcher said quietly as they took their positions. "You're good, really good. But I want you to know, I'm not holding back. I wouldn't want you to, Irene replied. The match that followed was the most technically proficient of the day. Fletcher didn't rely on size or strength, but on skill and experience that matched her own. They traded strikes and counters, each testing the other's defenses, looking for openings that neither easily provided. The 3-minute round extended as Kellerman allowed the match to continue, both fighters pushing themselves to their limits. Finally, Irene saw her opportunity. Fletcher had a slight weight shift before he committed to his power hand. When it came, she was ready, slipping his punch and delivering a spinning back elbow that caught him cleanly on the temple. Fletcher dropped like a stone, unconscious before he hit the mat. Captain Williams rushed forward immediately. That's it, Major. I'm calling this exercise. I've got 14 men requiring medical attention, 3 with injuries serious enough to need hospital transport. This needs to stop. Kellerman stared at Irene, who stood in the center of the circle, breathing hard but still upright, still ready. Around her, the remaining soldiers watched with expressions that ranged from shock to something approaching awe. She'd faced 11 opponents. She'd defeated 10 and accepted 3 forfeits. And she was still standing. The exercise is concluded, Kellerman finally said, his voice hollow. Everyone dismissed. As the facility emptied, Irene remained in the circle, her legs trembling with exhaustion, her knuckles raw beneath her training gloves. She'd won. But as she looked at the injured men being helped toward the medical facility, she wondered at what cost. This wasn't how she'd wanted to prove herself. This wasn't the recognition she'd sought. Lieutenant Anderson approached cautiously. That was. I've never seen anything like that. Irene pulled off her gloves, wincing at the soreness in her hands. It shouldn't have come to this. No, Anderson agreed. It shouldn't have. But, for what it's worth, I don't think anyone here will question whether you belong again. Irene looked at him, seeing the sincerity in his expression. Maybe he was right. Maybe sometimes, you had to break everything before you could rebuild it better. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. The summons to Major Kellerman's office came 3 hours after the training exercise concluded. Irene had spent that time in her quarters, icing her swollen knuckles and replaying every moment of the day. She'd known there would be consequences, but the exact nature of those consequences remained unclear. The walk across the base felt different now. Soldiers she passed offered nods of acknowledgement, some even stepping aside to let her pass. The invisible wall that had separated her from the rest of the unit seemed to have developed cracks. Whether those cracks would widen into acceptance or harden into deeper resentment remained to be seen. Kellerman's office was exactly what she'd expected. Walls covered with commendations and photographs from deployments spanning 2 decades. The major sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable. Beside him stood Colonel Patricia Brennan, the base commander, a woman whose reputation for fairness was matched only by her reputation for holding people accountable. Specialist Hill, Colonel Brennan began, her voice measured. We need to discuss what happened today. Irene stood at attention. Yes, ma'am. Major Kellerman has filed a report suggesting you used excessive force during a training exercise. He's recommending disciplinary action. Brennan paused, her gray eyes sharp. However, Captain Williams has filed a counter-report, stating that the exercise itself violated several training protocols and placed personnel at unnecessary risk. The silence that followed was weighted with implications. Kellerman's face had gone carefully blank, but Irene could see the tension in his shoulders. I've reviewed the security footage from the training facility, Brennan continued. All of it, and I've spoken with every soldier who participated or witnessed today's events. She turned to Kellerman. Major, would you like to explain why you ordered a training exercise that resembled a coordinated assault rather than legitimate combat training? Kellerman's jaw tightened. Colonel, I was testing Specialist Hill's capabilities under pressure. She's been claiming she belongs in advanced combat roles. I needed to verify. You needed to make her quit, Brennan interrupted. her voice sharp as broken glass. "Let's not pretend this was about assessment. You wanted her gone, and you orchestrated an exercise designed to break her." She placed a folder on the desk. "What you actually accomplished was demonstrating that Specialist Hill possesses combat capabilities that exceed most of the men in your program." Irene's heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't the direction she'd expected the conversation to take. "Colonel," Kellerman began, but Brennan raised a hand. "I'm not finished. This base has a problem, Major. We have talent that we're wasting because of outdated assumptions about gender and capability. Specialist Hill should have been recognized and properly utilized months ago. Instead, she's been marginalized, dismissed, and finally subjected to what amounts to institutionalized harassment." Brennan turned to Irene. "I owe you an apology, Specialist. This command failed you. We allowed a culture to persist that valued conformity over competence." She picked up another folder. "Effective immediately. You're being promoted to sergeant and transferred to the Combat Instruction Division. You'll be training the next generation of soldiers in close-quarters combat techniques." The words took a moment to penetrate. Promoted. Not disciplined. Not discharged, but promoted. "Additionally," Brennan continued, "Major Kellerman is being reassigned to administrative duties, pending a full review of his training protocols. Lieutenant Fletcher, once he recovers, will assume temporary command of the Advanced Combat Program." Kellerman's face had gone pale. "Colonel, I've served this base for 25 years. Yes, I know, which makes your behavior today even more disappointing." Brennan's expression softened slightly. "Vincent, you're a good soldier and you've done excellent work in the past. But the military is changing, and you need to change with it or step aside for people who can." As Irene left the office, her mind was reeling. Everything had shifted in a single day. The woman they'd tried to break had instead broken their system, exposing the flaws that had been there all along. The news of Irene's promotion spread through Forward Base Sentinel like wildfire. By evening, the entire base knew that the young woman who'd hospitalized 14 men was now being elevated to instructor status. The reactions varied wildly. Some celebrated the recognition of genuine skill. Others grumbled about political correctness. And a few simply tried to process the implications of what had happened. Irene found herself in the mess hall that evening, sitting alone with a tray of food she had no appetite for. The events of the day had left her physically and emotionally exhausted. She'd won the battle, but the war for acceptance felt far from over. "Mind if I sit?" Lieutenant Anderson stood with his own tray, his expression cautiously friendly. "Go ahead," Irene replied, grateful for the company despite her exhaustion. They ate in silence for a few moments before Anderson spoke. "I owe you an apology. I should have said something weeks ago when I saw what was happening. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere, that you needed to prove yourself without help. But that was cowardice, dressed up as principle." Irene looked at him, seeing genuine remorse in his face. "You weren't the one creating the problem. No. But I was complicit in letting it continue. We all were." Anderson pushed food around his plate. "What you did today, it forced everyone to confront things we'd been avoiding. Not just about you, but about the whole system." More soldiers began filtering into the mess hall for the evening meal. Irene noticed the glances in her direction, the whispered conversations. Some looked at her with new respect, others with resentment, and a few with something that might have been fear. Corporal Reed approached their table, his posture respectful. "Sergeant Hill, I wanted to apologize for not speaking up sooner. What Major Kellerman was doing, it wasn't right." The use of her new rank felt strange, almost surreal. "You spoke up when it mattered, Corporal." "That took courage." Reed nodded, then hesitated. "There's talk among some of the guys. They're saying you got promoted because you embarrassed the major, not because you earned it. I wanted you to know that's not what I'm saying. You earned it 10 times over." After he left, Anderson smiled slightly. "You're going to have allies now. People who saw what happened and recognized it for what it was. And enemies," Irene added quietly. People who feel threatened or embarrassed. True. But that's leadership, isn't it? Making decisions that matter, even when they're uncomfortable. The irony wasn't lost on Irene. She'd spent 6 weeks trying to prove she belonged in combat roles, trying to earn respect through competence and dedication. In the end, it had taken a confrontation that left 14 men injured and a major disgraced. There had to be a better way, a path that didn't require such dramatic demonstrations. That night, lying in her quarters, Irene allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. The physical toll was evident in her bruised knuckles and sore muscles. But the emotional toll was more complex. She'd proven herself, yes, but at what cost? The men she'd hospitalized were fellow soldiers, people who would potentially serve alongside her in actual combat situations. The relationships damaged today might never fully heal. Her phone buzzed with a message from her father back in the Czech Republic. He'd heard about her promotion through military channels. "Proud of you, little warrior," the message read. "Remember, true strength isn't about defeating others. It's about lifting everyone higher." The words resonated in a way that military doctrine never quite had. Her father understood something that many career soldiers missed. That the goal wasn't to prove you were better than everyone else, but to make everyone better together. Irene's first day as a combat instructor began at dawn. The Combat Instruction Division occupied a different section of the base, with facilities that were better maintained and an atmosphere that felt more professional. She reported to Captain Elena Rodriguez, the division commander, a career soldier with a reputation for excellence and fairness. "Welcome to the team, Sergeant Hill," Rodriguez said, gesturing for Irene to sit. "I've heard a lot about you, and I've reviewed the footage from yesterday's exercise. Impressive work, though I wish it hadn't come to that." "So do I, ma'am." Rodriguez leaned back in her chair, studying Irene with keen intelligence. "Here's the situation. You're going to face resistance from some instructors who believe you got this position through controversy rather than merit. You're also going to face skepticism from trainees who've heard about what happened and want to test you themselves." "I understand, ma'am." "I don't think you do. Not fully." Rodriguez pulled out a training schedule. "Your first class starts in 2 hours. 23 trainees, all male. All arriving with preconceptions about you. Some will want to prove you're not as good as advertised. Others will be looking for any excuse to dismiss your instruction. You need to establish credibility immediately, without repeating yesterday's performance." Irene considered this. "What do you recommend?" "Ma'am, teach them something they don't know. Show them that you're not just a fighter. You're an educator who can make them better fighters." Rodriguez smiled slightly. "And for what it's worth, I'm glad you're here. We need instructors who understand that combat effectiveness isn't about physical dominance. It's about adaptation, intelligence, and preparation." The training facility was filled when Irene arrived. 23 faces turned toward her, expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile. She recognized a few from yesterday's spectators, including Private Hutchins, the wrestler she'd defeated in under 90 seconds. "Good morning," Irene began, her voice carrying authority despite the butterflies in her stomach. "I'm Sergeant Hill, and I'll be your close-quarters combat instructor for the next 8 weeks. I know what many of you are thinking. You've heard about yesterday, and you're wondering if I'm qualified to teach you anything." She moved to the center of the mat. "So, let me address that directly. Yesterday was about survival. I was put in a situation where I had to prove I belonged, and I did what was necessary. But that's not what this class is about. This class is about making you more effective soldiers, regardless of your size, strength, or gender." A hand shot up from the back. "With respect, Sergeant, most of us are going to be bigger and stronger than our opponents. Why should we train like we're not?" It was a fair question, delivered without hostility. Irene appreciated the directness. "Because assumptions get you killed. You're going to face opponents who are armed, who outnumber you, who have advantages you can't overcome with strength alone. I'm going to teach you how to fight smarter, not just harder." She spent the next hour demonstrating techniques that leveraged mechanics over muscle, showing them how to redirect force rather than meet it head-on. She called volunteers from the class, working with them to illustrate principles rather than dominance. By the end of the session, even the skeptical faces had transformed into something approaching interest. That's all for today, Irene concluded. Tomorrow, we'll work on environmental awareness and using terrain to your advantage. Dismissed. As the trainees filed out, Hutchins approached. Sergeant, that was good instruction. Better than what we've been getting. I wanted to say, yesterday, I was angry about getting beaten so quickly. But watching you teach today, I get it now. You weren't trying to humiliate anyone. You were just operating at a different level. Thank you, Private. And for what it's worth, you've got good instincts. With some refinement of technique, you could be exceptional. After he left, Rodriguez appeared from where she'd been observing. Well done, Sergeant. You threaded the needle perfectly. Established authority without arrogance. Demonstrated skill without showboating. That's exactly what this division needs. 3 weeks into her new role, Irene had settled into a rhythm that felt more natural than anything she'd experienced in the military. Teaching came easily to her, the technical aspects of combat translating well into instructional methodology. Her classes consistently received high marks from trainees, and even the instructors who'd been skeptical initially were beginning to acknowledge her effectiveness. But the shadow of that day still lingered. Several of the men she'd hospitalized remained in recovery, including Lieutenant Fletcher, who'd suffered a severe concussion. The guilt Irene felt about his injury was persistent, a weight that no amount of professional success could fully lift. She visited him in the medical facility on a sunny afternoon, carrying a book she thought he might enjoy. Fletcher was sitting up in bed, looking pale but alert. Sergeant Hill. He greeted her with a slight smile. Come to finish the job? I'm sorry about what happened, Irene said, settling into the visitor's chair. I didn't want to hurt you. Any of you. Fletcher waved dismissively. I knew the risks when I stepped into that circle. Besides, I learned more from that 3-minute fight than I had from the previous 3 months of training. He paused. I've been thinking a lot about that day. About what Major Kellerman was trying to do and what actually happened. What did actually happen? Irene asked. A system got exposed. We'd been operating under assumptions that we never questioned, because they seemed self-evident. Women are physically weaker, therefore they're less effective in combat. But you proved that physical strength is just one variable among many. Technique, preparation, intelligence, adaptability. These mattered just as much, sometimes more. He shifted in the bed, wincing slightly. Colonel Brennan asked me to take over the advanced combat program. I accepted, but I told her I wanted to restructure everything. No more training that's designed to favor one body type or fighting style. No more assumptions about who belongs and who doesn't. Just pure skill development and tactical excellence. That sounds like exactly what the program needs, Irene said. I'm going to need help implementing it. Good instructors who understand that combat effectiveness comes in many forms. Fletcher looked at her directly. I'd like you to be part of the new program. Not as a student this time, but as a senior instructor. The offer caught Irene off guard. I've only been in the combat instruction division for 3 weeks, and you've already proven yourself more capable than instructors with years of experience. Your trainees are performing better, learning faster, and showing more tactical flexibility than any other group on the base. Fletcher smiled. Besides, I owe you. That elbow strike you caught me with? Textbook perfect. I want to make sure every soldier in this program learns technique like that. As Irene walked back to her quarters that evening, the base felt different. The sideways glances had transformed into respectful nods. The whispered comments had become requests for training advice. The isolation had given way to integration, slow and imperfect, but undeniably real. She thought about her father's message, about lifting everyone higher. Maybe that was possible after all. Maybe the confrontation that had seemed so destructive could become the foundation for something better. 6 weeks after the incident that had reshaped Forward Base Sentinel, Irene stood before a conference room filled with senior officers from across the European theater. Colonel Brennan had requested her presence at a briefing about modernizing combat training protocols, though Irene hadn't fully understood why, until she arrived and saw the agenda with her name prominently featured. Sergeant Hill will now present her findings on adaptive combat methodology, Brennan announced, gesturing for Irene to take the podium. Irene approached the front of the room, acutely aware of the stars and eagles on the uniforms around her. Generals, colonels, and senior staff officers, people who shaped policy for thousands of soldiers, all waiting to hear what a 23-year-old sergeant had to say about combat training. She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, a video compilation from her training sessions. Traditional combat training has focused primarily on physical dominance and standardized techniques, but modern combat environments require adaptability, creative problem-solving, and the ability to overcome opponents who may have significant physical advantages. The next slide showed performance metrics from her trainees compared to those in traditional programs. The numbers spoke for themselves. Her students were outperforming their peers in situational awareness, tactical flexibility, and mission completion rates. The key difference isn't the techniques themselves, Irene continued. It's the philosophy behind the training. We teach soldiers to think like chess players, not boxers. Every engagement becomes a problem to solve rather than a test of strength. A general in the back raised his hand. Sergeant, these results are impressive, but they're from a small sample size over a limited time period. How do you know this approach scales to actual combat situations? It was the question she'd been expecting. Sir, I've been coordinating with Lieutenant Fletcher to implement these methods in the Advanced Combat Program. We've run 12 simulation exercises against traditionally trained units. Our teams have a 78% success rate in objective completion, compared to 52% for traditionally trained units of equivalent experience. Another officer leaned forward. What about physical fitness standards? Are you suggesting we lower them to accommodate smaller or weaker soldiers? Absolutely not, sir. Physical fitness remains crucial, but we're expanding the definition of combat effectiveness beyond pure strength metrics. A soldier who can climb silently, move efficiently, and think tactically is often more valuable than one who can simply carry more weight. The presentation continued for another 30 minutes, with Irene fielding questions that ranged from genuinely curious to subtly hostile. By the end, she felt drained but cautiously optimistic. Several officers had requested copies of her training protocols, and Colonel Brennan wore an expression of satisfaction. After the briefing, a brigadier general approached Irene in the hallway. Sergeant Hill, I'm General Morrison from the Special Operations Command. Your approach interests me greatly. We've been looking for ways to improve our selection and training processes. Would you be willing to consult on a new program we're developing? The offer was unexpected and significant. Special Operations represented the elite tier of military service, and they were asking for her input. I'd be honored, sir. Excellent. My staff will coordinate with Colonel Brennan. Morrison paused. I have to say, when I first heard about what happened here 6 weeks ago, I thought it was a disciplinary disaster. But what you've done since then, turning controversy into innovation, that's the mark of real leadership. That evening, Irene called her father from her quarters. She told him about the briefing, about the opportunities emerging, about how the worst day of her military career had somehow become the catalyst for the best period. You know what I'm most proud of? Her father said, his voice warm through the phone connection. Not that you defeated those men. Not even that you got promoted. I'm proud that you took something ugly and made it beautiful. You could have let bitterness consume you. Instead, you chose to build something better. His words resonated deeply. The path forward wasn't about dwelling on past injustices or celebrating victories over former adversaries. It was about creating systems that prevented future soldiers from facing the same barriers she'd encountered. The restructured Advanced Combat Program launched on a crisp autumn morning. Lieutenant Fletcher, fully recovered from his concussion, stood beside Irene as they addressed the new class of 48 trainees, 22 women and 26 men, the most diverse group the program had ever accepted. "Welcome to what we're calling Combat Excellence Initiative," Fletcher announced. "This program is different from anything that's come before. We're not interested in who's the strongest or who fits traditional military archetypes. We're interested in who can think, adapt, and overcome." Irene stepped forward. "You're going to be challenged in ways you haven't experienced before. Some of you will struggle with physical demands. Others will struggle with tactical complexity. But everyone here was selected because you demonstrated potential that goes beyond conventional metrics." The training philosophy they developed was revolutionary in its approach. Instead of standardized exercises that favored certain body types, they created scenarios that required diverse skill sets. One exercise might demand raw strength. The next would require flexibility and precision. Another would test problem solving under pressure. Private Katrina Volkov, a former gymnast from Estonia, excelled at infiltration exercises that required navigating tight spaces and vertical environments. Corporal James Whitmore, built like a tank, dominated exercises involving equipment, transport, and defensive positioning. Neither was superior to the other. Both were essential to mission success. The most significant innovation was the team composition strategy. Instead of grouping similar soldiers together, they deliberately created diverse teams that forced members to leverage each other's strengths. Volkov's agility complemented Whitmore's strength. A soldier's tactical brilliance balanced another's physical prowess. 3 months into the program, the results exceeded even Irene's optimistic projections. The teams weren't just performing well. They were redefining what effective combat units looked like. During a major training exercise against a conventionally trained battalion, the Combat Excellence Initiative teams completed their objectives with minimal casualties, while the opposing force suffered significant simulated losses. Major Kellerman, now serving in an administrative role, attended one of the training sessions as an observer. Irene noticed him watching from the observation deck, his expression unreadable. After the session concluded, he approached her. "Sergeant Hill," he began, his voice stiff. "I've been watching your program. It's impressive." "Thank you, sir." Kellerman looked uncomfortable, his jaw working as he searched for words. "I owe you an apology. What I did, what I tried to do to you, it was wrong. I let my prejudices blind me to genuine capability. I see that now." Irene studied the man who'd once tried to break her. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by his own recognition of failure. But she also saw genuine remorse in his eyes. "I appreciate that, sir. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. I've been meeting with Colonel Brennan and the base psychologist," Kellerman continued, "trying to understand why I reacted the way I did, why I felt so threatened by change. It's been enlightening and humbling." He paused, watching the trainees running drills. "These soldiers, they're going to be better than anything my generation produced, not because they're stronger or tougher, but because they're more complete. You saw that when I couldn't. That's why you belong in leadership, and I belong behind a desk." After he left, Fletcher joined Irene. That couldn't have been easy for him. "No," Irene agreed. "But it was necessary. For him and for us." The program continued to evolve. Irene found herself traveling to other bases, presenting her methods, training new instructors. Each location brought familiar resistance. Officers who believed traditional methods were sufficient. Soldiers who resented change. Bureaucrats who worried about disrupting established systems. But she also found allies. Officers who'd watched their own talented soldiers marginalized by outdated thinking. Trainers who'd recognized the limitations of conventional approaches but lacked the authority to implement change. Soldiers who'd felt like outsiders in their own units because they didn't fit the traditional warrior archetype. 8 months after the confrontation that changed everything, Irene received orders to report to the European Special Operations Command headquarters in Stuttgart, Germany. General Morrison's earlier interest had translated into something concrete, a request for her to help design and implement a revolutionary new selection and training program for special operations candidates. The flight to Germany gave Irene time to reflect on the journey that had brought her here. Less than a year ago, She'd been a logistics specialist that nobody took seriously, relegated to equipment manifests, while others flew real missions. Now she was being asked to reshape how the military's most elite units identified and developed talent. The Special Operations Command facility was impressive in its understated way. Unlike the forward operating bases she'd grown accustomed to, this was a permanent installation with sophisticated training facilities and cutting-edge technology. General Morrison met her personally at the entrance. "Sergeant Hill, welcome. I trust your flight was comfortable?" "Yes, sir. Thank you." Morrison led her through the complex, pointing out various facilities. "We've been running selection courses for special operations for decades, using methodologies that have remained largely unchanged. They work, to a degree, but we're excluding talent that doesn't fit traditional profiles." They entered a conference room where a dozen officers and senior enlisted personnel waited. Morrison made introductions. These were the people responsible for special operations training across the European theater. "Sergeant Hill is here to challenge our assumptions," Morrison announced. "She's going to present an alternative approach to candidate selection and training. I expect everyone to listen with open minds and honest skepticism. This is too important for either blind acceptance or reflexive rejection." Irene's presentation built on the work she'd done at Forward Base Sentinel, but expanded it to address the unique demands of special operations. She demonstrated how diverse team compositions outperformed homogeneous groups in complex scenarios. She showed data proving that cognitive flexibility and adaptive thinking were better predictors of special operations success than pure physical performance. The room's response was mixed. Some officers nodded along, clearly intrigued. Others sat with crossed arms and skeptical expressions. A lieutenant colonel interrupted midway through. "Sergeant, with all due respect, special operations isn't like regular combat training. We need the absolute best, soldiers who can carry wounded teammates over mountains, who can sustain themselves in hostile environments for weeks. Physical capability isn't just important. It's essential." "I completely agree, sir," Irene replied. "I'm not suggesting we eliminate physical standards. I'm suggesting we expand our evaluation criteria to include cognitive capabilities, emotional resilience, and adaptive problem-solving. A special operations team needs diverse skills, not just variations of the same skill set." She clicked to a new slide showing mission analysis data. Special operations failures rarely result from insufficient physical capability. They result from inadequate intelligence, poor decision-making under pressure, or inability to adapt to changing circumstances. Yet, our selection process focuses almost exclusively on physical performance. The discussion that followed was intense and prolonged. Officers challenged her assumptions, questioned her data, and pressed her on practical implementation. But Irene had anticipated every objection, had prepared responses grounded in evidence and real-world results. By the end of the day, General Morrison called for a vote. "We're going to pilot Sergeant Hill's methodology with our next selection class. 6 months. Full implementation. Rigorous evaluation. If it works, we expand it across all special operations training. If it doesn't, we return to traditional methods." The vote passed, though not unanimously. Irene now had 6 months to prove that her approach could work at the highest levels of military operations. That evening, she walked through Stuttgart's historic center, trying to process the magnitude of what she'd taken on. The stakes were enormous. Failure would validate every skeptic who'd ever dismissed her methods as feel-good ideology unsuited to real combat. Success would transform how elite forces operated across the entire military. Her phone buzzed with a message from Lieutenant Fletcher. "Heard about your new assignment. No pressure, but you're now representing everyone who's ever been told they weren't good enough. No big deal, right?" She smiled at his attempt at humor, masking genuine encouragement. Another message followed from Captain Rodriguez. "You've got this. Remember, you're not trying to prove them wrong. You're trying to make everyone better." The distinction mattered. This wasn't about vindication or settling scores. It was about creating systems that identified and developed the best possible soldiers, regardless of whether they fit traditional expectations. The Special Operations Selection Course began on a cold January morning with 64 candidates assembled from units across Europe. The group's diversity was immediately apparent. Different heights, builds, backgrounds, and capabilities. Traditional selection courses would have eliminated half of them within the first week based purely on physical standards. Irene's approach gave everyone a chance to demonstrate their complete skill set. The first week focused on individual assessment across multiple domains. Physical capability was tested, but so were tactical reasoning, emotional regulation under stress, creative problem solving, and adaptive learning. Each candidate's strengths and weaknesses were carefully documented. Candidate Sarah Brennan, a communications specialist from Ireland, struggled with the physical endurance tests but demonstrated extraordinary situational awareness and tactical innovation. Candidate Viktor Petrov, a former boxer from Bulgaria, excelled at physical challenges but initially struggled with complex problem-solving scenarios. In traditional selection, Brennan would have been eliminated immediately. Petrov would have advanced based solely on physical performance. Irene's methodology kept both candidates, pairing them in team exercises that forced them to leverage complementary strengths. The second week introduced team-based scenarios that required diverse capabilities. One mission involved infiltrating a simulated enemy compound, a task that demanded Brennan's technical skills for disabling security systems and Petrov's physical capabilities for neutralizing guards. Neither could succeed alone, but together they were formidable. General Morrison observed the training regularly, his initial skepticism gradually transforming into cautious optimism. "I'm seeing things I never expected," he told Irene during a progress review. "Candidates I would have dismissed are becoming essential team members. The question is whether this translates to real operations." The answer came during the final exercise, a 72-hour scenario that simulated a high-risk hostage rescue in hostile territory. The teams faced every challenge that real special operations might encounter: hostile patrols, technical obstacles, time pressure, equipment failures, and casualties. Team composition made all the difference. Units with diverse capabilities adapted seamlessly to changing circumstances. When one approach failed, they immediately shifted to alternatives. When team members were simulated casualties, others covered gaps without losing effectiveness. The traditionally composed control group, selected and trained using conventional methods, struggled significantly. Their physical prowess was undeniable, but they showed limited tactical flexibility. When their primary plan failed, they had difficulty adapting. When specialized skills were required, they lacked team members with those capabilities. The final statistics were striking. Irene's diversely composed teams completed their objectives with an 86% success rate. The control group achieved 43%. The difference was so significant that Morrison immediately ordered the pilot program expanded. "Sergeant Hill," Morrison said during the final debrief, "you've fundamentally challenged how we think about special operations capability. These results aren't just impressive, they're transformative." But the most meaningful moment came from candidate Brennan, who approached Irene after the final exercise. "Sergeant, I almost didn't apply for selection. I'd been told my entire career that I wasn't special operations material because I didn't fit the physical profile. If you hadn't created this program, I would have believed them. Instead, I just completed one of the most challenging experiences of my life and discovered capabilities I didn't know I had." That evening, Irene sat alone in her temporary quarters, processing the success they'd achieved. The journey from dismissed logistics specialist to architect of military training reform had been improbable and painful, but it had also revealed something fundamental about human potential. That greatness comes in countless forms, and systems that recognize diversity of capability will always outperform those that demand conformity. 1 year after the incident that had defined her career, Irene returned to Forward Base Sentinel for a ceremony she never imagined attending. Colonel Brennan had requested her presence for the graduation of the latest Combat Excellence Initiative class, but there was more to the visit than simple ceremony. The base looked different to her now, Or perhaps she was the one who had changed. The same buildings, the same mountains in the distance. But everything felt transformed by perspective and experience. She walked past the training facility where she'd faced 20 men, the memory no longer painful but instructive, a reminder of how far both she and the institution had come. Lieutenant Fletcher, now Captain Fletcher, greeted her with a warm handshake. "Welcome back, Sergeant." Or should I say, soon-to-be Lieutenant Hill? The promotion to officer ranks had been unexpected but, according to Colonel Brennan, well-deserved. Her work with special operations had attracted attention at the highest levels of military command. Generals who once would never have considered her input were now requesting her consultation on training reform initiatives. "The base feels different," Irene observed as they walked toward the ceremony venue. "Because it is different. You changed it." Fletcher gestured at a group of female soldiers jogging past, their presence unremarkable now rather than exceptional. 18 months ago, there were 7 women assigned to combat roles at this base. Now there are 43, and nobody questions whether they belong anymore. The ceremony itself was held in the main parade ground, with over 300 soldiers in attendance. Irene sat on the platform alongside senior officers, watching as the graduating class marched in formation. The diversity was immediately apparent. Different genders, different builds, different backgrounds, all unified by proven capability. Colonel Brennan approached the podium to address the assembly. 15 months ago, this base experienced an incident that could have destroyed us. Instead, it forced us to examine our assumptions, challenge our biases, and ultimately become better than we were. The soldiers graduating today represent that transformation. She gestured toward Irene. "Sergeant Hill, would you please join me?" Irene stood and walked to the podium, uncertain what was happening. Brennan held a small wooden box, which she opened to reveal the brass insignia of a second lieutenant. "Effective immediately, you are promoted to second lieutenant in recognition of exceptional service and transformative leadership. Your work has not only changed this base, it has influenced military training doctrine across the entire European theater and beyond." The applause that followed was genuine and sustained. Irene looked out at the assembled soldiers and saw faces that reflected respect earned through demonstrated capability rather than grudging acceptance of administrative mandate. After the ceremony, several soldiers approached to congratulate her. Among them was Corporal Reed, who'd been one of the first to forfeit during that fateful day. "Lieutenant Hill, I wanted to thank you. After what happened, I questioned whether I belonged in the military, but watching what you built from that disaster, seeing how you turned hostility into progress, it taught me that belonging isn't about fitting in. It's about contributing something valuable." As evening approached, Irene found herself back at the training facility, standing alone in the combat circle where everything had changed. Major Kellerman appeared in the doorway, his posture tentative. "Lieutenant Hill," he began formally, then softened. "Irene, I heard about your promotion. Congratulations." "Thank you, Vincent." The use of first names felt strange but appropriate. They were no longer adversaries, just 2 soldiers trying to navigate the complexities of military service. "I've been working with the base psychologist, like I mentioned before. We've started a program for officers to examine their unconscious biases and how they affect leadership decisions. It's uncomfortable work, but necessary." He paused. "I was wondering if you'd be willing to speak to the group. Share your perspective on what happened and how it changed things." Irene considered the request. A year ago, she would have felt only anger toward Kellerman. Now she felt something more complex. Understanding that people could grow, that mistakes could become catalysts for positive change if people were willing to do the difficult work of self-examination. "I'd be honored," she replied. As they walked out of the facility together, Kellerman spoke quietly. "I tell myself that what I did, forcing that confrontation, it ultimately led to good things. But I know that's just me trying to rationalize behavior that was inexcusable. You shouldn't have had to fight your way to recognition." "No, I shouldn't have. But it happened. And we both learned from it. That's what matters now. What we do with those lessons." 3 years after the day that changed everything, Lieutenant Irene Hill stood before the International Military Leadership Conference in Brussels, addressing an audience of over 500 officers from NATO countries. Her presentation, titled Adaptive Leadership in Modern Military Organizations, synthesized everything she'd learned from her unlikely journey. "I want to tell you about a day that should never have happened," she began, clicking to a photo of Forward Base Sentinel. 3 years ago, I was a logistics specialist that nobody took seriously. My commanding officer, convinced I didn't belong in combat roles, orchestrated a training exercise designed to make me quit. 20 men, each ordered to defeat me in hand-to-hand combat. The audience leaned forward, captivated by the opening. By the end of that day, 14 men were hospitalized, and I was facing what I thought would be the end of my military career. Instead, it became the beginning of something I never imagined. She advanced through slides, showing the evolution of the Combat Excellence Initiative, the Special Operations Selection Program, and the broader training reforms that had followed. The lesson isn't that I was exceptionally capable or that my superiors were uniquely flawed. The lesson is that our systems were designed around assumptions that limited our effectiveness. When we challenged those assumptions and created more inclusive, adaptable structures, everyone benefited. She showed comparative data spanning 3 years. Units trained using adaptive methodologies consistently outperformed traditionally trained units across every meaningful metric. Retention rates improved. Mission success increased. Soldier satisfaction rose dramatically. But the most important change wasn't captured in statistics, Irene continued. It was cultural. We created an environment where diverse capabilities were valued, where soldiers could contribute their unique strengths without conforming to narrow definitions of what a warrior should look like. The presentation concluded with video testimonials from soldiers whose careers had been transformed by the new approaches. Candidate Brennan, now a Special Operations Team leader. Corporal Reed, who'd become an instructor in adaptive combat techniques. Even Major Kellerman, speaking honestly about his journey from prejudice to advocacy for inclusive leadership. After the conference, multiple defense ministries requested consultation on implementing similar programs. Irene's calendar, filled with speaking engagements, training sessions, and policy development meetings. The unwanted logistics specialist had become one of the military's most sought-after voices on leadership and organizational transformation. But the moment that meant the most came during a quiet evening at her parents' home in the Czech Republic. Her father, now graying and moving more slowly, sat across from her at the kitchen table where she'd eaten breakfast before school as a child. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "The path you chose? The battles you fought?" Irene thought about the question seriously. Parts of it were harder than they needed to be. "I wish I could have proven myself without anyone getting hurt. But regret? No. Every difficult moment taught me something. Every obstacle I overcame made me better equipped to help others." Her father smiled, the same warm expression she remembered from childhood. "You know what your mother would say if she were here? What? She'd say you took the anger and pain that could have destroyed you and used it to build something beautiful. That's the rarest kind of strength." A month later, Captain Fletcher called with news. "You're not going to believe this. The story of what happened at Forward Base Sentinel. It's being used as a case study at military academies across Europe and North America. They're teaching future officers about adaptive leadership, using your experience as the primary example." Irene felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride, certainly, but also humility. She hadn't set out to change military culture or become a symbol of transformation. She'd simply refused to accept limitations others tried to impose on her. The final validation came in an unexpected form. General Morrison, now serving at NATO headquarters, invited Irene to lead a new international task force on military training modernization. The position would make her one of the youngest officers ever to influence defense policy across multiple nations. "Your work has proven that diversity of capability isn't just a moral imperative, it's a strategic advantage," Morrison told her. "We need that perspective shaping how Allied forces train and operate." As Irene prepared for this new chapter, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From overlooked specialist to hospitalized 14 men to architect of military transformation, it was a path that made sense only in retrospect. Each impossible moment building toward outcomes she could never have predicted. She thought about the soldiers who would benefit from the systems she'd helped create, the talented people who would no longer be dismissed because they didn't fit traditional archetypes. That legacy mattered more than any personal achievement. The young woman they'd tried to break had instead broken their system and built something better in its place. And in doing so, she'd proven that the strongest warriors aren't always the biggest or the loudest. Sometimes, they're the ones who refuse to accept that impossible means permanent. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.